Welcome to everyone. Tonight's event is the first in a series of events planned for the academic year that addresses systemic racism in the United States. The title of tonight's presentation is Mental Health, the Intersection of Racism and Trauma. I want to, first of all, thank the task force for all its work in putting this together. And I want to extend a special thanks to Dr. Marianne Ward-Paragosa and to Vice President, or I should say Associate Vice President Gregory Perrin of the Development Office. They have been leading this task force, and I am very grateful for their dedicated and inspirational leadership. I want to thank our speakers and panelists. You'll meet them a little bit later. They'll be introduced. But first, I want to comment on tonight's event and why it is so important in today's events and today's world. Systemic racism is frankly the scourge of our national history. It has been simultaneously obvious and denied in each of the eras of our country's existence. One of those negative impacts of the many, many negative impacts of racism is, of course, the impact on people's mental health and well-being. And research has shown that it is particularly, or has a particularly strong and negative impact on people of color, leading to higher levels of anxiety and depression in Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And this is what we want to talk about tonight. Tonight has two objectives. One is to develop a deeper understanding of mental health and problems caused by racism. And second, to help us all become allies of those who are resisting this kind of difficulty, helping with the populations in this kind of difficulty, and also becoming advocates in our society to push back further and further and finally destroy racism and its ugly impact on our society. So thank you for joining us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Marianne Ward-Paragosa and Gregory Perrin.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. We will begin with a land acknowledgement statement. We pause to respectfully acknowledge that St. Edward's University sits on the land of the Coahuilcan, Tonkawa, Comanche, and Apache peoples. We remember their continued connection to this region and give thanks to them for allowing us to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. We pay our respects to elders past and present. We recognize the grave harm and injustices brought by colonialism to all Indigenous people and to those of African identity who were stolen from their homes and enslaved on our campus. We grieve the vast loss of life, languages, and traditions. We deeply regret our own community's role in slavery, segregation, and upholding systemic racism. As a Holy Cross institution of education and transformation, we seek to learn, reconcile, and bring healing by addressing the wrongs of the past and acting now and in the future to bring about a better time.
Thank you, Gregory. Welcome to this evening's program, The Intersection of Racism and Trauma. The program is an interactive workshop with experts on mental health using the power of story to learn more about how structural racism causes trauma, as well as personal and societal stigma in BIPOC communities. Participants will learn how they can become advocates and allies in the process of supporting students, faculty, and staff and making effective and compassionate referrals to on and off-campus resources. As we navigate this very important conversation, we know that some of the content could be potentially distressing intellectually and emotionally. We invite you to listen for the community group you are a part of and write down the phone number that best applies to you, just in case it is helpful later on. If you are an SEU student and find yourself in a state of crisis, please call our after hours number. It is UPD's dispatch number 512-448-8444 to connect to the counselor on call. If you are a faculty or staff member and need crisis support, please call 800-343-3822 to speak with a live person 24/7. If you are a member of our alumni community and wish to access a crisis line other than what you might use through your own resources, you can call SAMHSA's toll-free national helpline, 1-800-662-HELP, 1-800-662-4357. This service is also 24/7. For those of you that are interested in getting connected to counseling services or resources both on and off campus, we have some dedicated time for this later on in our program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. Totandra Shea Grays. Dr. Grays is licensed as a clinical social worker by the Texas State Board of Social Worker Examiners and is a board-approved supervisor. She holds a bachelor's degree in social work from the University of North Texas. She holds a master's degree in social work and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Texas at Arlington. Dr. Grays completed her PhD in family studies at Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas. Dr. Grays is a certified family life educator provided through the National Council on Family Relations. She currently works as a clinical social worker in a public hospital in Dallas. Dr. Grays has served professionally as a clinical social worker in a public health system, as a psychotherapist in a public school district, and as an adjunct professor in higher education. She has been licensed for 20 years and has 20 plus years of service to the community. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Grays.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and I certainly am excited to be here and have this much needed conversation. While we won't be able to engage in an in-depth groundwater analysis today, my hope is that this conversation will be an introduction to a greater self-evaluation and future conversations on systemic racism in mental health. So I'm a member of the REAL committee, which is a committee in the National Association of Social Workers. And REAL stands for Race, Equity, Accountability, and Leadership. And the mission of the REAL committee is to educate and equip NASW Texas members to identify and change racist practices within relevant institutions. The REAL committee was established in 2017, and so we've been working just to build membership so that we can have more boots on the ground. I want you to just kind of take a look at this slide for just a moment. Systemic or institutional racism is essentially the distribution of power, resources, and opportunity to the benefit of white people and the exclusion of people of color. Mental Health America defines racism as a mental health issue because racism causes trauma. This slide shows the impact of institutional racism across various systems. Institutional racism is greater than the act of one person or a group of people. It is a larger issue seen across various systems. So when you look at this slide, you can't simply dismiss this as an individual issue. People of color are not inherently bad, but imagine for a moment that you fare worse than all other races across the system. So as you can see on this slide, it's showing the educational system, the child welfare system, juvenile justice, the criminal justice system, and health. And these are just a few of the systems, but as you can see, African Americans have the worst outcomes across the board in all of these systems. And while it only shows African Americans and Hispanics and Anglos, we know that this is probably mirrors many other BIPOC communities. It's not too far-fetched that a person can begin to believe that these things are true about them, that they're inherently bad, when you kind of see your racial group across the board have the lowest outcomes. And that in and of itself is trauma. There has to be a systemic connection at play. Institutional racism isn't always obvious. It's sometimes it's just, it doesn't appear to be what it is. It's often less overt and more subtle. And so sometimes people don't recognize that the systems they work in engaged in practices that negatively impact communities of color. Many people in the helping field, they enter with good intentions. They don't become social workers or mental health professionals. They don't enter the helping field to intentionally cause harm to people. But in many of these systems, again, as you can see on the screen, policies and practices can unintentionally cause harm. The fact of the matter is, these systems were not created to help people of color. So how do agencies respond to people of color when the systems were never intended to serve this population to begin with? We must understand that at the root of every institution we see, the same bias, the same structures that deliver the same outcomes for the same group of people. This is why agencies really need to do a groundwater analysis to get at the root cause as to why the same group of people have the same outcome. Agencies must engage in anti-racist work. Next slide. So this slide shows a list of terms. And the term is, you can see on the left-hand side in the definition, and then the system is most commonly used in. So if we are honest, when we look at these terms, what group of people automatically come to your mind? Just a question to ponder. And so as far as this slide is concerned, mental health would of course fall under the health disparity. But again, when you look at those terms, what group of people come to your mind? Next slide. So I don't want to take away from the BIPOC community. I don't want to take away from other people of color and their experiences, but I am going to focus a little bit on the impact on African Americans. So as it relates to mental health, Black and African Americans sometimes experience more severe forms of mental health conditions due to issues such as racism and discrimination. And again, this can be applied across the board. The Black and African American experience in America has and continues to be characterized by trauma and violence more often than for their white counterparts, impacting emotional and mental health of both youth and adults. When addressing mental health in the Black and African American community, we must consider the experiences of Black and African Americans and the manner in which they understand and cope with mental illness. This means we can't utilize a Eurocentric approach to address the mental health challenges of Black and African Americans. A cookie cutter approach is simply not sufficient. And while the experience of being Black and African American varies tremendously, there are shared cultural factors that play a role in defining mental health. Part of this shared experience is facing racism, discrimination, and inequity that can significantly affect a person's mental health. Being treated or perceived as less than because of the color of your skin can be stressful and even traumatizing. Processing and dealing with layers of individual trauma, in addition to issues such as police brutality in news media, racial profiling, and divisive political rhetoric, adds compounding layers of complexity for individuals to responsibly manage. Black and African Americans deal with individual trauma and also collective trauma. Individuals often deal with serious mental health issues, but communities of color also deal with a collective mental health crisis. There's this idea of collective sorrow, which is defined as a shared feeling of deep distress, caused by loss, disappointment, or other misfortunes suffered by a group. When Black and African American communities continue to see the killing of unarmed Black and African American men, women, and children, and police face no consequences, this can create psychological ambiguous loss in families and communities. This loss occurs without closure or clear understanding. Individuals and communities grapple with this ambiguous loss, causing them to become preoccupied with losses that never make sense. The premise is that ambiguity coupled with loss creates a powerful barrier to coping and grieving, and this can lead to increased symptoms of depression, along with other mental health issues. Mental health professionals are well-intentioned and seek to help those in need. I truly believe that. But in some cases, they end up unintentionally causing harm. This may be due to the fact that some mental health professionals have not had an in-depth analysis of the history of institutional and structural racism and how it impacts the people that we serve. Without that understanding, it may be challenging to understand and address institutional racism at work, in systems and institutions where we serve, including the mental health field. A great place to start is to acknowledge and address our own conscious and unconscious biases towards people of color. But we must also address racist policies and practices that can cause trauma in the systems in which we work. This is the work we have to do as professionals in the mental health field. It's not enough to be well-intentioned. We must be more culturally intelligent and engage in anti-racist work. The People's Institute conducts undoing racism trainings that can help us learn to engage in anti-racist work. It's no longer acceptable to be willfully ignorant. By not engaging in anti-racist work, we can unintentionally cause or exacerbate trauma to the very people we seek to help. There's a saying that when we know better, we do better. Okay, next slide. People and communities are the experts on themselves, and in order to adequately address their needs, we must engage them in identifying what those needs are. So again, I repeat, while I've addressed the African American culture, this is across the board. We cannot be willfully ignorant. That's just no longer acceptable in this day and time. We have to do the work. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about my own experience with 2020. I'm sure we could all write a book on our experiences with 2020. It has been that year. And so I consider myself a pretty strong person. I've always been kind of the helper in my family. I've always been the person that people come to, but 2020 really kind of beat me down. And I will tell you, just seeing the reoccurring racial issues, George Floyd, and then we had Breonna Taylor, and it was just one person after one person. And while I don't know George Floyd, I didn't know him, I didn't know any of the people personally, that collective trauma that I mentioned earlier, I actually started to feel the impact of that. And, being confined to my home, it really caused me to sit in those feelings. It really just caused me to really just experience my own grief with that. So while I didn't know these people personally, it had that impact on me because of that collective trauma. And I'm a member of this page on Facebook. It's called Black Therapists Rock. And again, one of just the reoccurring things is how people just talked about how they were just mentally exhausted. I always tell people, my soul is tired. And it's kind of hard to put that into words, but that's the best way I could describe how I felt, is that my soul is just tired. Because, while I can say, okay, that happened to George Floyd and he had these issues, and it happened to this person and they had these issues. And I think of myself as this professional person. And, I used to think, honestly, if I can be honest, oh, that's not going to happen to me. I'm educated, pay my taxes, that whole thing. But what I realize is I'm still a Black woman. It doesn't matter how educated I am. It doesn't matter how many degrees I have. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. At the end of the day, I'm still a Black woman. And I find myself driving in certain neighborhoods. I check my speedometer to make sure I'm not speeding. like I'm very conscious when I see a police officer, I'm very conscious of kind of my own behavior and making sure I don't look suspicious or making sure I don't look, like I'm doing something wrong because, I don't want to get stopped. So I could go on and on and on because I am a social worker and a therapist and I can, talk your heads off. But I just wanted to share that that's a little bit of my experience with 2020 and my experience just dealing with this collective trauma.
Thank you, Dr. Grace. I think this is a really good format for us to get going and include more of our panelists and add more information and help everyone in the room to talk about the issues you have brought to a good light here. Appreciate your help with that. My name is Ana Escamilla, and some of you know me and some of you don't. I am a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Texas. I've been in the mental health area for 40 plus years. I'm the co-founder of a Waterloo Counseling Center, which is a counseling center that's been in effect for about 35 years here in the Austin area, serving the LGBTQ community. I'm also currently working a little bit with the CAMP program on campus at St. Ed's. But my background too comes from being a Latina and having the impact of what that means in my day-to-day life and how it affected both my mental health as well as the people who've been my clients for those 40 plus years. I think it's important for us to realize that this day and time, a lot of folks are saying, well, racism doesn't exist. But I do think that what we need to talk about is the microaggressions, the small innuendos, the kind of things that I experience almost daily, like things like, gee, Ana, are you Latina? You don't look Latina, and you don't speak with an accent. Things like that really are very insulting and eventually accumulate and hurt people in terms of their own self-esteem and, contribute to depression and even anxiety at times. It is traumatic. It is traumatic to hear that over and over again and remind yourself daily almost that, in fact, you are not in the general public, you're outside of the general public, and that somehow you have to work extra, you have to be stronger, you have to be tougher, you have to have a different mindset. You even have to take care of your own personal safety because that's not a guarantee either. And I think that those kinds of issues are the kinds of issues that affect both Black and Latino minority cultures and mental health issues. I think too that I could go on and speak about the lesbian and gay communities. That's certainly not racial, but it is cultural. And I do know that one of the reasons that we founded Waterloo Counseling Center was because it was the beginning of the AIDS crisis. And there was a lot of people in the Austin area who were not able to go and get mental health services from the existing mental health practitioners in the city. And so this was a way to allow them to have access to mental health at a time when they were in tremendous crisis and indeed trauma. So that said, that kind of gives you an overview of why I came to this and what I'm doing. What I'd like to do now is transfer over to some of the other panelists. Dr. Pena, are you available?
I am. Good evening, everyone. I'm Vanessa Pena. I'm currently the director of the Health and Counseling Center here at St. Ed's, and I'm honored to be here with you this evening. I'd like to share a little bit about my own story and how it is that I joined the mental health field. In my mind, I feel like my story is quite simple, mostly defined by my identity as a Hispanic female. seeking spaces that were not often occupied by people of color. I was actually born in Houston, Texas, which is a city of great diversity. However, my most crucial developmental years took place in the Rio Grande Valley. So my family and I moved to Brownsville, Texas when I was 8 years old, where truly the minority are the majority. So for those of you that don't know the Valley, it's largely Mexican or Mexican American in culture with very little diversity. My mom, a Mexican immigrant who speaks Spanish only to this day. So I really have her to thank for being fully fluent in Spanish. Spanish was my first language, and I didn't learn English until I went to school. I am a first generation college student, which, to be honest, that label didn't really sink in for me until I was in college and I was able to compare my experiences to those of others. As a college student, my first sort of personal or academic goal was to be the first amongst my siblings to be able to hand my dad, also a Mexican immigrant like my mother, he's a construction worker his whole life. I really wanted to hand him a college diploma that belonged to one of his 3 kids. He worked really hard to be able to offer us the education that he didn't have access to, which he often likes to remind us of still. My brother and sister attempted college but never finished. And as the youngest, I really pressured myself to be the first to sort of deliver that honor to my dad. As I explored some career options, I somewhat naively, I think, chose psychology simply because it was a class that was offered at my public local middle school and something that sounded really interesting to me. I had never met a mental health professional in my life, but at that time, I knew that people were drawn to tell me their stories. And I wanted to find a career where I could really listen and help people. I actually remember writing a book report on suicide when I was in the 7th grade, which at that day and age, did not set off any kind of alarms to anyone. I feel like if I did that now in 2020, people would be really concerned about it. But for me, it was really just an interest. It wasn't because I was having any kind of thoughts or anything related to that. I just wanted to learn more. I then attended college at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. I was a McNair Scholar. Faculty really took me under their wings at that point, and I learned about graduate school. It wasn't until grad school that I realized how few BIPOC folks actually got advanced degrees, let alone doctorates. I was the only person of color in my doctoral cohort. And at that time, I was often really uncomfortable when professors asked me for my opinion regarding my culture. And I did not feel like I could represent sort of my entire ethnic group. That just didn't feel right to me. It was also, though, at that point that I learned how important it was to see representation and how crucial it is for students and for therapy clients to see themselves in educators and, in my case, in mental health providers. So that's really where I found my passion for higher ed. And I now feel really privileged to be part of this small number of BIPOC mental health professionals that can really offer that representation we need so much, both inside and outside of a classroom. So that is a little bit about my story.
Thank you, Dr. Pena. That was another piece of very important information, I think, for everyone to hear. We have yet another panelist today, and he is currently with our Health and Counseling Center here on campus, although he's also a full-time PhD student at UT. His name is Nolan Kruger. Nolan, are you ready to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yep. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for that brief introduction. So yeah, I'm honored to be a part of tonight's event and to participate. I want to briefly recognize those of you who are joining us tonight who are already doing the work, already engaged in this work. And hopefully, I know we're packing a lot in tonight, but hopefully this can be a call to arms to do anti-racist work for some of you. So as Anna mentioned, I am a doctoral candidate in counseling psych at UT Austin and currently a clinical trainee here at St. Edward's. And I'll give you a brief story about what got me to this point. So 10 years ago, I was actually incarcerated briefly for a marijuana-related offense in the SF Bay where I'm from. And it was actually that experience that clarified my vision and exposed me to the disproportionate overrepresentation of Black and brown folks in the criminal legal system and the abusive behavior of law enforcement officials. So on a psychological level, though, what really I witnessed there was how so many of these young men had an internalized stigma and had internalized the stigma associated with justice involvement and really held the belief, understandably, that their fate was already sealed and that they were destined to cycle just continuously through the legal system, whether it be through incarceration, probation, fees and fines, you name it. So fast forward a couple of years, I decided to continue on in higher education and pursue a degree in clinical psych from the University of California, San Diego. So I moved down south. And initially I chose psych because, I don't know, I wanted to pursue knowledge for knowledge's sake and work with folks directly. Honestly, I don't know. I wasn't that clear beyond that. But once I got to San Diego, I feel like I was hit over the head with the mirror image of the situation that I'd experienced and witnessed in the criminal legal system, which was now the glaring underrepresentation of Black and brown folks. And I noticed just kind of the psychological correlates there, how we empower folks based on higher education, based on that college degree, and how we destigmatize and how we stigmatize and dehumanize folks in the criminal legal system. So at this point, I came to realize that these two things, what I had seen prior and what I was seeing at UCSD, were of a piece. And over the next few years, I refined my focus to track toward counseling and educational psychology. So these are sub-disciplines of the field of psychology, and I realized they'd allow me to address racial inequities and injustice through psych-informed policy that attempts to essentially re-envision what justice and accountability looks like, to be more humane, racially equitable, trauma-informed, et cetera. And that I could also take that lens to higher ed, institutions of higher ed, and work on some of the cultural and structural forces of white supremacy and anti-Blackness that maintain and reproduce racial inequity every day. So here I am, 30, going on 31 in a few weeks, 10 years removed from my justice involvement, almost 5 years removed from my undergrad experience. I've worked in prisons, bringing accredited college courses to correctional settings. I've done a fair amount of work in university spaces, supporting Black and brown students through anti-racist advocacy, culturally congruent approaches to mental health. And I'll leave you with this. Dr. Tutundra, she spoke to the intergenerational trauma, and it's true. Black folks all over the country, and of course, Black students, we carry historical trauma. And only so much of the necessary healing can be done without university staff, faculty, administrators from every corner of campus taking a consistent, focus on consistent there, and a proactive and unequivocal approach to calling out and dismantling white supremacy and promoting racial justice. So ultimately, I felt called to be a part of tonight's event and facilitate this evening because while students are playing a pivotal role in the fight for racial justice, it's ultimately up to us and ultimately up to you all, campus administrators, student affairs, educators, et cetera, to do the emotional, the physical, the mental, the social labor that's needed to address racial injustice and anti-Blackness on university campuses. So this event is an opportunity, albeit a small one, to engage in that work.
Thank you, Mr. Kruger. That's, I think what we all three have represented is different facets of racial injustice and mental health, and its dedication to dealing with racial injustices and the trauma that it causes. So I'm hoping that will help everyone here tonight move on to the next piece of this tonight, which is going to be our small groups. We'll go into breakout rooms and you will be able to be facilitated by mental health professionals and others that are available to talk with you tonight about the issues that we have brought to the light so far, and hopefully get some good discussions going. After we do that, we'll come back together again, and there's some additional information that is available to everyone. So don't leave after you've finished with your breakout room. Please stay around.